During Sir Robert's world travels around the 1970s, he was inspired by the world's historical castles and wanted to do the same for Ulfstead. And so, during the past decade, he had agreed with Sir Charles to extend the line from Farquhar and past the quarry through to the village of Ulfstead and to the castle. He even agreed with the Think controller about extending the line from the lake to the castle for visitors travelling on the Skarloey with the newly found Duke. In the year 1980, he was reading a newspaper where he saw an advertisement for Croc's scrapyard, where he found Glyn on the cover, an engine he remembered from his youth, still alive. At that moment, however, the coffee pot engine was about to be cut up, since no one took ownership of him for 29 years. But luckily Sir Robert had arrived just in time to make a deal. Because of the focus of restoring the castle and Duke, and setting up tours with Stephen, Glyn's restoration was placed on the back burner. The extension was finished later that year, and a grand opening was made. While King of the Railway did focus on the restoration of the castle and the opening, none of the events from the movie had really happened. The events that were shown in season 17 had happened, except for these episodes. Sometime after the celebrations, Thomas and his crew were told that the Farquhar station master's car and gardening cups were stolen the other night. While Thomas was making his way with his passenger train, he saw the stolen car close by, and was trying to see if it was the station master's. When it turned out it was his stolen car, they raced to the signal box and wrote a message about the car for the signalman and placed it in a lunch tin so it could be thrown to him. When they did, they shouted, "Police!" But the car was out of sight, but the signalman had called the police and they blocked the car's path, arresting the thieves. Everyone cheered for Thomas at Farquhar, and cheered even more when they found that the station master's gardening cups weren't damaged. Sir Charles, who was present at the station, says to the passengers that once again, Thomas had proved to be a really useful engine. This can be found in Railway Series book number 27, Real Useful Engines, by Christopher Audrey. Meanwhile, during the summer, Henry's tender had become loose on the main line at Kildane, and a fire had ignited on the track. While the driver was controlling the blaze, Edward took Henry's train on. The cause of Henry's tender being uncoupled was due to his roughness with the coaches, after James had insulted him of his green paint, saying that he doesn't disappear in the background like some engines, implying Henry, and that he should be yellow and black like Mavis, as earlier Henry remarked he would never like to be red like James, as people might think he was a fire engine. However, he would soon gain red paint in the next decade. A temporary coupling was made for Henry so he could get back home, and after the other engines were told by Edward what had happened, they were very careful what they were talking about that night. But Henry had never made rude remarks about fire engines again. In the winter, Sir Charles had brought in another diesel on trial from British Rail. It was called 40125 of the 40 class diesel fleet. When he found out he was to share the shed with the other engines, he refused to go further and called them out-of-date objects and dirty, smoky, slow things. This made Boko, who was showing the diesel around, cross, and told the visiting diesel to stay outside instead, and called him old stuck-up. James, who still had deep suspicion about Diesel, despite being respectful and friendly with Boko and Bear, hoped that it would be cold that night, and that he couldn't start in the morning. Next morning, old stuck-up was making his way to be cleaned and refueled, but slid on some oily tracks made by Boko and Bear, and he crashed into the back wall of the shed. He was badly damaged, but he had left a dreadful draught through the hole. However, the engines, including Boko, thought it was funny, and knew that he deserved it. While Sir Charles's engines had accepted diesels, James had never liked them. He thought they were mixed up engines and wondered how they would know they are coming or going if they have two windows at either end, or that if an important engine like him didn't know which way to turn. This annoyed the other engines, and James grew more and more conceited. One day he was annoyed that he was to shunt trucks while Donald and Douglas were away on Edward's branch line. During that day he was shunting well wagons in the yards. The weather was damp and misty, making it hard. The signalman had a hard time too. He was instructed by James's driver that they would whistle once they collect all the trucks and clear off the points. However, an engine close by had whistled, and the signalman thought it was James and switched the points. The points had changed, but James wasn't clear of them yet, and halfway one of the trucks' bogies went the right way, but the other was diverted over the main line and smashed a signal off from the ground. Sir Charles was cross that the signal was damaged, as it was important, and its loss was inconvenient. It wasn't James's fault, however. but he was unusually quiet in the shed that night. With it being winter, the countryside was frozen hard with frost and icicles everywhere, but with little snow. James was at the workstation taking a passenger train and needed some water. However, it overflowed because James's fireman forgot to tell the driver to turn the tap off. After they had left, James began to feel thirsty, and as the driver turned on the injector, nothing happened. The fireman turned on the duplicate and still nothing. With no water flowing, this would be very dangerous, as no water in the boiler could cause an explosion, and so they had to stop. A diesel, called Jeff, was called from the works to take James and his train back to the workstation. However, James thought it was most undignified to be rescued by a diesel. However, Jeff was friendly towards James, and although the red engine was quiet at first, he was won over by Jeff, and the two became good friends. The problem with the injector was found, and it turned out that the overflow of water had frozen James's tank, stopping the air from getting into the tank, and would be alright when the ice melted. After being friends with Jeff, James realized that diesels can be useful too. These events can be found in Railway Series book number 28, James and the Diesel Engines, by Christopher Audrey. The Peel Godred Hydroelectric Power Station had decided to open tours of their dam to the public and to conduct special steam train operations. However, with the mountains being victim to heavy snowfalls during the winter and steep grades, the power station had decided to commission for a cab-forward steam locomotive based on the experimental cab-forward steam loco number 21 Thomas Stetson from the North Pacific Coast Railroad in the United States. Over in Japan, after a 6-year wait, 9 more Railway Series books were translated and released in bookstores. In the new year, Percy's friend Tom Tipper was given a bike instead of his van, as the postmaster had decided that it was too expensive to run. Usually with his van, he would often be cheerful towards Percy and would help load the train, but with a bike it no longer made him cheerful. One day he was told by a man from the station office to sign some papers, which made Tom feel very anxious for being late, and propped his bike against a fence and went away. As Percy was about to leave, some boys came and played on the platform and took Tom's bike, and as Percy puffed away, one of the boys pedaled down too far across the platform ramp and ran out of control. Thankfully, the boy jumped off just in time, but Percy had accidentally crushed Tom's bike into pieces and was beyond repair. Percy's crew, the station master and guard had all told the boys what bad boys they were. When Sir Charles heard about this, he ordered that Tom should be given a new bicycle at once. But the next day he was given a smart new van instead, which made him and Percy very happy. Later, Henry was to take a special order of fish on the Flying Kipper, and needed extra vans, which were old and had been used for a long time. Because of the heavy train, he has to have an engine to bank him up Gordon's Hill. Duck was to be a banking engine, and when he and Henry surged up the hill, trouble started brewing. Henry was pulling harder than he thought, and Duck felt his buffers slacken. Then, to make matters worse, a tail lamp on Henry's train had come loose, and Duck nor his crew couldn't see it. He whistled, but there was no reply from Henry. Then there was trouble. Poor Duck was damaged, but the accident wasn't his fault in the end, and Sir Charles told him that they would soon have him in working order again. After that, some people from the mainland had arrived with drawing pads. A man going by the name of David and a woman going by the name of Hilary were visiting the island with a crew to analyze the engines as well as the locations on Sodor. This is where Sir Charles had announced that they were here to research for a children's television show based on the Railway Series books by the Reverend W. Audrey. The crew were from Clearwater Features, a film production company located at Battersea in South London, and Hilary was better known as Britt Allcroft, owner of the Britt Allcroft company that looks after the television series. The engines were told that they were to have model counterparts playing as them. The engines were amazed and excited, but some thought why not use the real deal. But Sir Charles had told them that running a railway and being television stars at the same time would be nightmarish. Meanwhile, events of season 24 had happened except for these stories. In Japan, The last 2 Railway Series books by the Reverend W. Awdry were translated and released in bookstores. As of 2022, Christopher's books of the Railway Series were neither translated nor released in Japan. Meanwhile in Germany, the first 2 Railway Series books were translated and published in the book Thomas der Tankerlok, which is Thomas the Tank Engine in German, and was published by Ravensburger. Over in Wales on the mainland, the Talyllyn Railway was seeing a slow process of passenger and visitor numbers on their railway, and with Sehated in need of repairs, one volunteer came up with the idea of inviting one of the Scarlowy engines. A letter was sent to the Thin controller about it, and it decided to send Sir Handel to the railway. However, he said that he can't spare him until Duke is back from his repairs. Sir Handel was excited and grew rather impatient, and one day Sir Handel's passengers were boarding Beatrice, as the summer season brought lots of visitors to the lake, and he grew impatient when the guard was checking their tickets. After the passengers had embarked on their train, and the guard heading for Beatrice, Sir Handel steamed away, leaving the guard behind. A passenger noticed this and pressed a button, making a buzzing sound in Sir Handel's cab. His crew were surprised until they discovered who was left behind. When they reached Crovan's Gate for Henry's train, Sir Handel promised that he would try to be patient. When Duke returned, he was to take trains for the Scarlowy Railway and to the Earl of Sodor's estate at Ulfstead Castle. While visiting him, Duke told Sir Robert all about the Mid Sodor and Stanley the American engine. The Earl wondered whatever happened to him, and because he was likely never to have been sold, the Earl, along with a couple of men, went out in search of him. They looked around the old route, but couldn't find Stanley until they heard a voice when they were camping near Casterharwin. The voice belonged to Stanley, and sounded like he was saying sorry to someone. For years, Stanley had been haunted by ghosts of the old miners that had died during the flooding of the mines when he had failed as a pumping engine. Sir Robert was ecstatic when he and his team had found Stanley, although it had left the American engine in a state of surprise. But the Earl introduced himself and explained why they were looking for Stanley. He then told them about Duke, and the men told him about Peter Sam and Sir Handel and the closure of the Mid Sodor Railway. He was taken to the works to be cosmetically restored. Later he was sent to Ulfstead to be placed on display. Meanwhile, Hugo was all restored thanks to Sir Robert and his friend Franz Klein, whom Sir Robert had met and befriended during his world travels in West Germany. Over on the Talyllyn Railway, journalists from television, newspapers and magazines had come to the railway to report Sir Handel's visit, since after all the Railway Series books were already well known 10 years after Wilbert Awdry had finished writing them. Sir Handel's visit to the railway had been cooperated by the publishers Kay and Ward, the 2 railways, and Wilbert Awdry. Wilbert was also at the launch event, acting as a representative of Sir Handel Brown II. Railway Series books were also handed out too. After the launch, Sir Handel carried on with his duties at the Talyllyn. Meanwhile, back on Sodor, Rusty was busy with hedge cutters as they trimmed trees and bushes beside the railway so that the passengers could see the view. Rusty then takes them away in his trucks down the line. But when Peter Sam was taking the morning train, some branches were blocking his path after a wind had blown them over during the night. Peter Sam puffed through them as they were only small branches, but then came a cutting that was full of brambles with thorns. They were caught into each other, and the branches stayed firmly put, so Peter Sam was stuck. The brambles were caught in his valve gear, and his fireman had to cut him out with his thick gloves and a knife from the guard, along with the passengers who had also had knives as well, and eventually he was freed, although Peter Sam's front stayed uncomfortable for days. Later during the summer, Duncan was helping out some Boy Scouts who had set up camp and helped out with the railway by bringing them some lemonade, since it was very hot on their final day of camp. Back on the Talyllyn, Sir Handel had an accident with a tree branch by smacking into it, hurting him. Luckily it didn't hit his eye, but his crew made such a fuss about it that they decided to put a bandage and eye patch on his face. Sometime after the incident, he had also pulled the Talyllyn's annual general meeting train, AGM for short, and a wedding train full of guests. Back on Sodor, the Peel Godred's new cab-forward steam locomotive was built, and was named Lexi. Later in November that year, back at the Talyllyn, 2 royal visitors had arrived to visit the railway during the autumn. They were Prince Charles and the late Princess Diana, who were touring Wales. A royal train took the royal couple from Pendray to Ryder End Station. Sir Handel didn't take the train, but he was greeted by the royal couple. Back on the island, Harold had discovered Hero's hiding place and had reported it to Sir Charles. Hero was lifted back on the track and was taken back to the work station to be repaired. The people who had stolen him were soon arrested. Some events of season 18 had happened, except for these stories. Gator returned to the island of Sodor around Christmas after leaving Sodor 16 years ago. After an 11-year hiatus, the Railway series books had come back, this time written by Christopher Awdry. The first book that he had written was called Really Useful Engines. An event was held at Titmouth's W.H. Smith bookstand with Christopher Awdry, Sir Charles and Wilbert Awdry in attendance with some of the engines that had appeared in the book. Meanwhile, production of the first season of the television series was in swing, and Sir Charles Topham Hatt was invited to Clearwater Features with Wilbert Awdry to see the production. Sir Charles was amazed by the workmanship of the models and sets. Months before visiting the production, the producer of the television series, Britt Allcroft, had given Sir Charles a copy of the show's pilot of Down the Mine. Reports have said that Sir Charles approved of the look of the show before showing it to the people at ITV. Meanwhile, Sir Handel carried on with duties at the Talyllyn Railway due to his popularity with children. The events of Percy to the Rescue had happened, but its story wouldn't be recounted until the 1985 annual. On October 9, 1984, the first season of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends had been broadcasted on British television, narrated by the former drummer of the Beatles, Ringo Starr. The first episodes were Thomas and Gordon and Edward and Gordon. A launch party was held on Sodor, with the attendance of Britt Allcroft and David Mitton and the Awdry family. Ringo Starr had other commitments but wished all the best to the engines and Sir Charles on Sodor, and would love to visit them one day. A month before the show, the second book by Christopher Awdry, and the 28th overall, James and the Diesel Engines, was released in bookstores. Hero was all fixed up, and his first job was to take Sir Charles Topham Hatt for his retirement party at Titmouth Station. His son Sir Stephen Topham Hatt had taken over as the controller of the railway. During that year, Sir Handel had returned to Sodor from the Talyllyn and began telling the other engines his stories there. The events from the 1985 annual stories had happened this year as well. The events of the Strawberry Special happened during Toby's time on his old tramway at East Anglia on the mainland, prior to its closure in 1951. Percy and the Christmas Tree had happened in the year of 1984 as well, but its story wouldn't be told until the 1986 annual. The television series had proven its popularity, and the engines began to see merchandise of themselves either at the bookstand at Titmouth Station or in the hands of some children. One of the major brands to have merchandise for the television series was the model railway company Hornby. There was also the first VHS and Betamax tape of the show released that year, simply called Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, released by Guild Home Video, with the first 13 episodes of the first season that was broadcasted the year before. It was also the 40th anniversary of the Railway series, and the third book by Christopher, Great Little Engines, which is the 29th book overall, was released, which tells the stories that had happened in the year 1982. A launch party was held at Lakeside Station on the Skarloey Railway. However, the book had proven unpopular with Sir Handel and Duncan that led to the two Awdrys not visiting the railway for a long while. Wilbert Awdry had written another book about Thomas, this time recounting the events of when he crashed into the station master's house back in 1960. The book was simply titled, Thomas Comes to Breakfast. Meanwhile, on Thomas's branch line, Thomas was being boastful about his blue paint to Percy and Toby at the sheds. But the two engines had teased him, which made him cross. However, one day his blue paint got dirty from one of Percy's coal trucks, and Thomas had blamed Percy for doing it on purpose. A couple of days later, Percy had his own accident with coal. As he puffed near the water tower at the top station, something had cracked, and he couldn't stop at the buffers, and he ran right into the coal bunker. This made Thomas laugh, but the feud between the two engines lingered on. A little while later, Thomas had grown ill, and Sir Stephen had sent him to the big station if he could get better, but to no avail, and Edward had to take him to the works, and Duck was left to run his branch line. Duck knew Percy already since he came to the island 30 years prior, and as he worked on the branch line, he had made friends with Toby, Bertie, Mavis, and Terence the tractor. Annie and Clarabel were fond of him too for such nice manners. Thomas returned and his two coaches were telling him how well Duck had managed. Though he was jealous, he was glad to be home, and soon forgot about Duck. However, his affair with Cole wasn't forgotten, and Percy was careful to keep out of his way. One day, Thomas's fireman was ill, and was replaced by a relief man. At the junction, they were waiting for Henry's passengers. As soon as Henry appeared, his wheels started to move. This was because Thomas's handbrake was left very stiff since being at the works. The brakes seemed to be made if they were hard on, when in fact they were not. The relief man had forgotten all about it, and Thomas became a runaway, leaving his passengers and crew on the platform. Harold soon came to his rescue with the inspector, who screwed his brake hard on. Meanwhile, on the main line, the viaduct was in need of repairs to strengthen the arches, and the engines had to take great care, which would often delay Thomas's trains at the junction. That made Thomas cross, and he complained about it to Henry. Bertie was cross with Thomas for being late, as he would usually arrive just after Thomas. Bertie teased him and thought he could beat Thomas now since he would be late, and that made Thomas cross, and he complained about the mainline engines being late. One day, Thomas waited for James, who was held up at the big station, and made it worse on the viaduct. Thomas puffed away trying to make up time, but then found Bertie with his radiator steaming. Bertie asked Thomas to take his passengers for him, and Thomas accepted it, and took the passengers, learning that being late isn't such a bad thing after all. Meanwhile, Percy was growing tired of his feud with Thomas, and wanted to be friends again. He had a good day with his expert handling of trucks, and was thinking about what to say to Thomas and Toby. But he was so busy thinking that he didn't watch where he was going, and ran into a hanging broken tree branch that hit his smoke box. Thomas was unsympathetic, and Percy was so cross that he forgot about his resolution and talked to Toby instead. The next day he was still talking to Toby, and later that night he had asked him about the term drip. Toby thought it was when rain came through a hole in the cab, and the fireman didn't have time to mend it. But Thomas told him the real term angrily, as he was getting tired of being ignored by Percy. The term drip means a coward, or silly, or a spoilsport. However, Percy still didn't get it, and Thomas called him a drip, and went to sleep, leaving Percy offended. Next day, Henry's train was late, and Thomas had to make up for lost time. But then one of his side rods broke and punctured his water tank, making it a leak. The driver called the station master at the top station and asked Percy to rescue him, but Percy was still cross with Thomas and said he should stay there and be a drip himself. But when the station master told about the passengers and Annie and Clarabelle, he realized how silly he was and rescued Thomas. Thomas apologized for calling Percy a drip and wanted to be friends again, and Percy was delighted to agree. These stories can be found in More About Thomas the Tank Engine by Christopher Audrey. Events from the 1986 annual had happened. During the year, the Great Western Railway had celebrated 150 years of its establishment. Despite that by this time, it was really called the Western Region of British Rail, as it was since the nationalisation of the mainland's railways in 1948. In celebration of it all, events were made across the Western region, including a special exhibition train called Western Progress 1835 to 1985, featuring 150 years of GWR history, with a dummy of Isambard King de Brunel with a projected face. Brunel is considered as one of the greatest engineers of all time. Despite the exhibition train travelling around parts of the Western region, Sir Stephen Topham had made special arrangements with the Western region to bring the train to Sodor for Duck and Oliver, who were given the honour of pulling the train to Tidmouth. Around that same time too, City of Truro had been restored in time for the celebrations. Prior to that, the locomotive had been withdrawn from service in 1961 and was taken to Swindon's GWR Museum, now called Steam, the following year, 1962. But 22 years later, Truro was sent to the Severn Valley Railway in 1984 to be restored in time for the 150th celebrations of the Great Western. For a bit of fun, the railway had decided to repaint one side of Truro into BR black and sent it to a magazine which ran an article about it on April 1st. Although the SVR were joking, the joke itself didn't go down too well with those people who didn't get it. By the time the photos were published, City of Truro was applied with his trademark GWR green with red frames. After the 150th, Truro was sent back to the National Railway Museum and ran tours during the decade. During the year as well, the NRM was celebrating 10 years of its establishment by having an open day, and to make it even more special, Mallard ran in steam, although without its streamlined casing and balances, as it was being restored in time for the 50th anniversary in 1988 of his record-breaking run of 126 miles per hour in 1938. Back on Sodor, it was a week before Christmas, and Sir Charles was organising a Christmas carol concert at Tidmouth with the engine, staff and passengers, along with the mayor at Tidmouth. He had chosen Thomas to collect the Christmas tree, much to the jealousy of Gordon and Henry. Next day it was snowing, and after Thomas collected the tree, he got stuck in the snow, and was then buried underneath. Donald and Douglas came to his rescue, and had found Thomas. Edward and James arrived with more help, and all the engines went back to Tidmouth just in time for the carols. Then Harold arrived with Father Christmas, Santa Claus, giving out presents to all the children, and wished the engines a happy Christmas. The party was a great success in the end, despite Thomas getting stuck in the snow. Some sad events came out from the year 1986. Over on the mainland, the Reverend Teddy Boston had passed away at the age of 61 on April 1st. In the book, Font to Footplate, that was published 4 months after his passing, Wilbur Awdry wrote, "In thinking of our Teddy, it is important to realise that despite the impression that this book may seem to give, he was a parish priest first and a steam enthusiast second. He never forced religion on anyone, but his sincere faith and devotion was there for all to see, coupled with his impish sense of humour." And over on the island of Sodor, the refreshment lady, who Peter Sam had accidentally almost left behind back in the 1950s, had passed away as well, after 21 years of retirement. In her will, she had left her daughter and son-in-law her cottage. Meanwhile on the Northwestern, Donald was telling the mainline engines about high-speed trains that run on each end on the mainland that can go at 125 miles per hour. Gordon snorted and believed that he could go faster than those engines, since there was one of him. He kept on bragging and mentioned about Mallard, his cousin's speed record that he achieved 48 years prior, and when he took the express, he wanted to show those diesels which were better at speed. But when he was coupled to his train at Tidmouth, frost from the previous night had made sleet on the rails, and when Gordon puffed away, his wheels slipped on the icy rails, surging water in his boiler forward, and, with his heavy train, was held back, keeping him to a standstill. Sparks were flying from his wheels. His driver and the inspector tried to stop him, but to no avail. In a quarter of an hour, Gordon used up all his steam, and at last stopped when his driver closed the regulator from the reduced pressure. Donald shunted Gordon to the shed, and Henry took over the express. Low-grade coal had come to the island, and Gordon was feeling bunged up by it. Because of this, Gordon had produced heavy ash, and as he came forth towards his hill from Wellsworth, he had spoiled the clothing from a party of wedding guests who were standing on the platform. They complained to the station master. Gordon was cross that he was blamed for the incident, saying that it wasn't his fault that the coal was dirty. Meanwhile, Sir Stephen was making his way to the other railway, and had broken the journey to apologise to the wedding guests at Wellsworth. While he was waiting for another train, Gordon came rushing through, spraying out more ash, and some had landed on Sir Stephen's new top hat. The inspector had told him Sir Stephen's message, and although Gordon was saying he tried to be careful, he went sadly back to his shed. A week later, James told Gordon that Sir Stephen was coming back to Sodor, and hearing that, Gordon grunted. He wasn't anxious to see Sir Stephen, and that he told himself that he must do well. However, Gordon had a late departure thanks to a last-minute passenger, and when they were halfway up his hill, he felt a clatter beneath him. His fire bars had collapsed from the middle, creating a hole in his fire. The driver told the fireman to find the biggest piece of coal that would stop the cold air from getting in, and would hold the steam better. Luckily, a large piece was found near the front of the tender, and he placed it in Gordon's fire, making him much better. Gordon tried his hardest up the hill, until at last he reached the top. Because of his effort, Gordon was given a rest, and was placed in the goods loop with the passengers telling Gordon what a useful engine he was. Boko pulled him from the workstation to Barrow, and Sir Stephen was there too, and had given Gordon some good words about his efforts. But his conversation was cut short, as he had to hurry to his carriage, leaving Gordon in suspense. Later, Gordon returned to Barrow, and saw that the platform was crowded. A group of people were going to Carlisle on the mainland, but their engine had failed, and the station master came up and asked Gordon to help. With Sir Stephen's approval, he had to find an engine to take Gordon's return train, which happened to be Pip and Emma, the high-speed trains. However, Pip's cooling system was rather faulty that day. but Emma didn't mind doing the hard work. They felt honoured to visit the Northwestern after hearing so much about it on the mainland, thanks to people watching the television series. However, along the way they had failed, and James, who was taking a stopping train, came to help them. He was surprised at how light they were. They arrived at Tidmouth late, but it saved an awkward situation. All the engines made Pip and Emma feel welcomed, and James was glad that Gordon wasn't at Tidmouth, as he might have upset them. Gordon came home the next day, and Sir Stephen forgave him for the smokescreen with his hat. It turned out that what landed on his hat was some ash thrown by a steward, emptying an ashtray from a carriage window. Sir Stephen mentioned to Gordon about Pip and Emma, and wanted him to take their passengers home to London, and to prove a point on how they do things on Sodor. These events can be found in Railway Series book number 31, Gordon the High-Speed Engine, by Christopher Awdry. Later, Percy had grown ill, and was sent to the works. Sir Stephen Topham Hatt needed an engine, and the only engine that BR could spare was the infamous Devious Diesel. Although Diesel had returned to Sodor in 1965, this was the first time the engines had seen him in nearly 30 years. Thomas and Toby had warned him not to cause tricks, since they heard the stories of him. But Diesel was being sly. One day he pushed some trucks right through the buffers at the top station, since they were making fun of him, and Sir Stephen was so cross for what he had caused, he was going to arrange Diesel to be sent home, although Diesel was glad that was happening. A day or two later, Daisy, who would usually help on the branch line occasionally, was leaking oil as she was taking passengers to market. When Thomas crossed the same path as her, his wheels began to slip on the oil that Daisy had left, and he was going down the hill towards some trap points, which had derailed Clarabel. Meanwhile, Diesel had heard about Thomas's incident and thought it had served him right. But then he realized that Thomas was blocking his pathway home, and he had to go and rescue him. After the rescue effort, everyone praised Diesel for his heroic effort, and even Diesel was sorry that he was going home. Clarabel put in a good word for Diesel to Sir Stephen, and everyone hoped that Diesel would return to Sodor again soon. But would he be the same engine? During the summer on the mainland, Mallard officially came back into steam in time for his 50th anniversary celebrations for 1988. He had hauled some special trains from York to the seaside town of Scarborough in July. Later that year, the second season of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was broadcasted, and was once again narrated by Ringo Starr. Another launch party was held at Tidmouth, and this time with Ringo Starr in attendance, and this will be the only time one of the Beatles had ever visited the island of Sodor. The first episodes to be broadcasted were Thomas, Percy and the Coal, and Cows. 2 days before the second season, the fourth book by Christopher Awdry, and the 30th overall of the Railway series, More About Thomas the Tank Engine, was released in bookstores. Only 2 stories from the book were adapted for the second series, which were Thomas, Percy and the Coal, and The Runaway. Events from the 1987 annual had happened. Terence Turn's Pot Hunter happened as well, despite featuring in the 1988 annual. Around the same time, the television series went international in Norway, with Thomas and Gordon being broadcasted there in April of that year. Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree was published in time for Christmas, recapping the events from 1985. This too was also adapted for the second season of the television series. Despite Duchess being thankful that she was saved from the Scrapper's torch, she had grown bored of being on display at a holiday camp, and she began to show signs of decay thanks to the salty sea air of Barry Island. Around the same year, Butland, the company, had announced that their Barry Island camp would have no place in their future, and would close after Christmas that year. Because of the announcement, Duchess was bought by Sir Robert Norrby, and had decided to use her for rail tours around the mainland to help finance for Ulfstead Castle, as well as other future projects for the years to come. 2 VHS tapes featuring more episodes from the first season had been released on the mainland and Sodor, which were named after the episodes Troublesome Trucks and Coal. Sir Stephen Topham Hatt had said that the bridge along the river along Thomas's branch line needed repair, and although Toby and Percy, along with Daisy, are lighter, Thomas is too heavy, and had sent him to work on Edward's line instead. Thomas wanted to bring Annie and Clarabel, but Sir Stephen told her that they would be needed on the branch line, and Percy would look after them. Later that day, Mavis, who was late, was taking some trucks down to the quarry for Toby. The trucks were pushing her, and then the lorry came veering towards her at the crossing, where Thomas got in trouble by the constable, and it crashed right into the corner of her cowcatcher. Luckily, the lorry driver was okay, but he was new to the island and didn't know who Mavis was. The lorry incident had left Mavis's front bent, and she was sent to the works once again to be mended, and Toby had to look after her work while Percy took Annie and Clarabel with Daisy, as well as looking after the shunting. Meanwhile, on Edward's branch line, Thomas met up with Bill and Ben for the first time since seeing them back in 1975. The twins made fun of Thomas's blue paint, which made him cross, but Edward told him not to take them too seriously. The next morning, Thomas too had an incident involving a lorry as he was making his way to Brendan with a goods train. A crossing passes a lane, and a lorry filled with milk and eggs had broken down. The driver moved it, but Thomas was coming and he smashed right into it, causing all the eggs to fall over him. The lorry driver ducked for cover behind a hedge before Thomas crashed into his lorry, but it was very sad to see what had happened to his lorry after the impact. Thomas was covered in egg yolk, and while his crew were trying to clean him up, the heat from Thomas's boiler had cooked the eggs and was stuck fast on Thomas. Bill and Ben came to the yard, still teasing Thomas while the egg yolk tank engine was garnishing his teeth in frustration. It took a while to clean Thomas, and the twins kept on teasing him until Edward told them to stop. He then told them about a party of railway enthusiasts coming to the island next week. Bill and Ben promised to behave since they love enthusiasts making such a fuss over them and taking their photographs. They kept on asking Thomas each day if it's next week already, but Thomas loved to keep the twins in suspense. Meanwhile, back at Farquhar, Percy was needed at the harbour, since there was an emergency, and Sir Stephen wanted Percy to sort it out. However, with Toby away at the quarry and Daisy taking passengers, there was no one to look after the yards for him. The station master soon made arrangements to have Terence the tractor to look after the shunting, using a special frame to help him move the trucks. Meanwhile, at the quarry, Toby was in need of a drink, but the water tower that was once near the office of the quarry manager had been taken away, since Mavis was a diesel. Toby was bothered. Without water, his fire had to be put out, and he would be stranded until rescue came. However, a solution was made. One of the quarry workers had told him that there is a tap in the restroom and kitchen, and he would be welcome to use those while another workman went back to his home to fetch his old rusty hosepipe reel. Soon the water was loaded into Toby's small tank, but it took a very long time to fill. At the harbour, the emergency was that a large but disagreeable barge named Bulstrode was grumbling about the trucks not shunted where he should be. However, the trucks retaliated by saying he was in the wrong place, not them. Percy arrived as Bulstrode sulked and the trucks annoyed. The trucks asked Percy to place them in a siding where he could be loaded up and be rid of him. So Percy did, but when he was shunting, he took some trucks to the slope of the hill that was near the harbour, and when he stopped, one of the trucks' brakes slipped on, and when he began to push, the truck started with a jerk and broke a coupling, making 4 trucks loose with heavy stone. The 4 trucks went straight to Bulstrode and crashed into his hull, and the trucks had burst a hole bringing water in. This gave the barge an awful sinking feeling, but it was low tide. The trucks were sad that they lost their friends, but laughed at Bulstrode's predicament. Percy helped clear the mess, and took the remains of the trucks to the scrapyard, while the workmen rescued what stone was found. Bulstrode was taken to a nearby beach where he was moored there, where children could play on him all day. To this day, Bulstrode is still moored there. Back at the quarry, Toby's tanks had been filled, but he was behind his work at the quarry and returned to his shed at Farquhar dark. Next week arrived, and the enthusiasts had arrived on board Thomas. The enthusiasts were making notes in their notebooks and took photographs and videos. They queued up to ride in the cabs of the twins, and some forgot to duck their heads given the squat cabs, but they didn't seem to mind, except for some sore heads. The day was nearly over when a shunter came and asked one of the twins to help a ship to be moved before the tide goes down. Ben went on his way, leaving Bill behind. Most of the visitors went to see the whole thing, while one man stayed behind with his camera taking instant pictures. He asked for one more, that Bill was getting tired of him. Then Ben's fireman came asking to help Bill to move the ship since it was about to go aground, and he couldn't move it on his own. A cloud of steam roared out of Bill's cylinders, while the man was still taking photographs. However, he had expressed his disdain once he peeled the picture and threw it away. Meanwhile, the 2 engines had pulled the ship off the mud and into deeper water. They soon found the discarded picture, and the driver showed it to Bill. The picture was his funnel poking out from the clouds of steam from earlier, although very dimly. Bill then remarked, to no one in particular, "What a picture!" Meanwhile, Trevor the traction engine wasn't feeling well. He was in need of a new boiler, but the vicar couldn't afford the repairs at present. But while sawing up some fallen trees, he saw some of Edward's trucks being derailed on a bad piece of track. The guard blew his whistle, but Edward didn't hear, but Trevor did and blew his whistle to attract Edward about the derailment. When they noticed, work soon began to clear the line. In the end, Sir Charles rewarded Trevor to have his boiler mended at his works, much to the delight of the old traction engine. Months had passed and autumn came, and with it came rain. Along the line near the clay pits lay a part of the track known as the drain, which is often flooded by heavy rain. When the heavy rain and wind came, the puddle began to rise to the point it covered the track, and poor Ben splashed into it and put out his fire, stopping him in the middle of the line. Ben's fireman came to the yards, all drenched and wet, and found Thomas, who was waiting for Ben with his trucks, and had asked him and his crew for help. Thomas came to his help and pulled Ben out of the water with a strong cable. Ben was grateful for Thomas's help, as also was Bill, and in 4 days after the water from the drain was drained out, the twins agreed that it would be ungrateful to them to tease Thomas after what he had done for them. Back at Farquhar, the months had passed and the weather became colder with hard frosts during the night. One night the ground was frozen solid, causing it to swell. In the morning, as Toby made his way towards the quarry, the frost had swollen the earth in the ruts close by the railway line, so much that Toby's wheels were lifted off the rails and derailed. Thankfully, he wasn't going fast. His 6 wheels were all on the roadway. His driver had a solution. He carefully reversed Toby along the ruts his wheels had made, and at last he was re-railed again, and went to the quarry safely. Mavis returned home, and Sir Stephen had heard about Toby's roadside stop, but he wasn't cross with Toby, and Toby had told him about Terence who had shunted Percy's trucks months ago. Sir Stephen then told Toby that he should leave roads to what they were made for, and that he should stay on rails since they are more comfortable, and Toby was quick to agree. Meanwhile, the circus came back to the island, and James was chosen to pull it as seen in James Pulled the Circus Train by Christopher Audrey. The stories of Toby and Percy can be found in Railway Series book number 32, Toby Trucks in Trouble, and the stories of Thomas on Edward's Line can be found in the 32nd book, Thomas and the Twins. Meanwhile, the Hosepipes and Shunters story can be found in the 1990 Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Annual, all written by Christopher Audrey. The 3 VHS tapes featuring the episodes from the second season were released, which were Thomas, Percy and the Coal, Percy and Harold, and The Deputation. Around the same time, the television series had gone over to the other side of the world to Australia on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC. During the same year, the first VHS tape of the television series was released as well, simply titled Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. The Australian tape shares similarity with the videos that were released on Sodor and the mainland back in 1985 and 1986. Troublesome Trucks and Coal were also released later that year as well by Festival Records. The show had also aired in New Zealand close by the same year. Meanwhile, the events from the 1988 annual had happened, with the exception of Thomas and Trevor, as that happened back in the 1950s, and Terence Turns Pot Hunter happened in 1986 as stated earlier. The story responsibilities happened before Thomas was sent to Edward's Line. The events of Post Early for Christmas happened as well, however that wouldn't be told until the 1989 annual. Meanwhile, Gordon the High-Speed Engine, the 1988 annual, and Thomas and the Evil Diesel were released in bookstores, recounting the events that had happened in 1986. Meanwhile, Wilbert Audrey, along with his brother George, had written a book showcasing the history of the island of Sodor, including its railway, called The Island of Sodor, Its People, History and Railways. Nowadays, this book is very hard to come by, and is considered the holy grail for fans of the books. With the popularity and success of the television series in the UK, Norway, Australia and New Zealand, Britt Allcroft was planning to take the show stateside. Prior to production of the American show, a man going by the name of Jay Islin, the head of Channel 13, PBS's New York station, came back to New York from England with a videotape that had one of the stories of Thomas the Tank Engine. He had given it to another man named Rick Sickleco and asked if he could do something with it. This would be the first time anyone in the United States had heard about Thomas, as the Railway Series books had never really gotten off from there before, nor had they ever heard of the island of Sodor. Rick then showed the tape to some children at an elementary school, and the children had grown to like it. Before that, there was some doubt of the show taking off in the United States. After that, both Allcroft and Sickleco had developed the idea of bringing the stories from Sodor to the United States in a half-hour program, and that would eventually become Shining Time Station, with Ringo Starr agreeing to play Mr. Conductor and tell the stories of Thomas and his friends to an American audience. It was lucky too that he agreed, as he scored big over in America with the Beatles in 1964. Filming of the show began that year, with extra security for Ringo, as it had just been 7 years since his former band member and friend John Lennon had been tragically murdered on December 8, 1980. Meanwhile, over on the mainland, Scott was getting fitted with some modifications at Southall. He was invited to take part in a special railway event on the other side of the world, and that was to Australia. 1988 was the bicentennial year for Australia, celebrating 200 years of British settlement, and in Melbourne, Victoria, there was to be a special bicentennial event called Aussteam 88, inviting many engines across the country to celebrate the railway's contribution to the development of the country, although the bicentenary wasn't really popular amongst Aboriginals, due to it being a celebration of colonialisation which had brought injustice, suffering, and dispossession. Scott was already done by the autumn, and was then unloaded at Sydney to get ready for the festivities that October, while also doing trips in Victoria, and then heading back to New South Wales. Meanwhile, back on Sodor, the bridge was repaired and Thomas returned to his branch line. The events that were written for the 1989 annual had happened around that time. Events from Thomas and the Baby, Percy the Seaside Train, and Henry Pulls the Express had all happened as well. During 1988, the Talyllyn Railway in Wales on the mainland had invited Peter Sam to run trains on their railway, while Edward Thomas was away for repairs, as well as the success of Sir Handel visiting the railway. Once again, Wilbert Awdry was acting to represent Sir Handel Brown II, along with son Christopher and grandson Richard. Guests had travelled by bus to see the ceremony, and the Talyllyn Silver Band played to welcome Peter Sam to the railway. During that year as well, Mallard had done several trips around the UK to celebrate the 50th anniversary of his record run. Meanwhile, over in Australia, the 3 Season 2 tapes that were released on the mainland and Sodor in 1987 were released down under by Festival Records. Meanwhile, the 6th book written by Christopher and the 32nd overall, Toby Trucks and Trouble, recounting the stories from 1987, as well as Toby's early days from 1935, was released in bookstores, as well as the annual for 1989, and James Pulls the Circus Train. We now come to the end of the 1980s, and during that time the Berlin Wall had come down, unifying the east and west of Germany after 28 years of division. Meanwhile, the first episode of Shiny Time Station, A Place Unlike Any Other, was broadcasted on January 29th of that year, and the first episodes were Thomas and Gordon and Edward and Gordon. However, while we know the true titles of those stories, they were given new names. Thomas and Gordon became Thomas Gets Tricked, and Edward and Gordon became Edward Helps Out. Ringo Starr tells the stories, but he also plays an 18-inch tall man who lives within the walls of the station, using the power of gold dust called Mr. Conductor, who tells the stories to the children at the station. In order for the show to be seen by American children, it had to be a mere 28 minutes, and so the television series needed a vehicle to introduce American children to the television counterparts of the engines of Sodor. And because of railway terminologies being very different between the UK and the United States, terms like trucks had to be called freight cars, or points being called switches, etc. Even the nickname that was given to the many of Sir Topham's over the years, as had been stated in the books and the show, the Fat Controller, had to be changed to his Sunday name due to obesity issues. Meanwhile, Scott was making tours across the country of Australia, drawing a crowd wherever he goes, as he is the most famous steam locomotive in the world. He was even helped out by Australia's most famous steam locomotive 3801, as well as other various engines from the state of New South Wales, and would also parallel with some other engines from different states that run on different gauges. One of his biggest achievements during his time in Australia was another non-stop record run between Parkes and Broken Hill in New South Wales, which was 422 miles, during his epic long trip to Alice Springs in the Northern Territory. As of 2022, he still holds the record to this day. To know more of Scott's journey across Australia, take a look at the Flying Scotsman Down Under video that I did back in 2021. In New Zealand, Communications and Entertainment Limited, CEL Home Video for short, had released the first 3 VHS tapes, which were Thomas and Gordon, James and the Express, and Percy Runs Away. Back on the island of Sodor, Thomas's driver was going to have a birthday party at the sheds of Farquhar with the engines, and Thomas was excited as he had never celebrated someone's birthday before. However, he was sent to help at the big station, much to his worry that his driver might miss out on his party. However, Sir Stephen knew about this and had told Thomas that he would get him home in time after shunting some trucks. He finally returned and his driver was given a big surprise, and Thomas was surprised too by the driver's cake. In the end, it had been a successful day, and Thomas was happy that he had been to a birthday party. This can be found in the mini-book Thomas and the Birthday Party by Christopher Audrey. Meanwhile, the NWR celebrated its 75th anniversary. Later, a hot air balloon race was being held on the island of Sodor, and James was asked to take the balloons to the starting line. He wanted to stay and watch the race, but he had work to do instead. However, one balloonist ran out of hot air and believed they'll be out of the race. James helped to take the balloonist to the finish line, and in the end, they had made it just in time to land with the other balloonists. This can be seen in the mini-book James and the Balloons by Christopher Audrey. The events that were published in the 1990 annual had happened, with the exception of Old Square Wheels, as that happened in 1957. Meanwhile, the 7th book, written by Christopher Audrey, and the 33rd overall, Thomas and the Twins, was released in bookstores, recounting the events from 1987. The 1990 annual was released, as well as the mini board books Thomas and the Baby, Percy the Seaside Train, and Henry and the Express. Over on the Skarloey, Fred, who was built from 2 diesel locomotives on the National Coal Board, who the railway had purchased from, came to the railway to start work. However, Rusty thought he was lazy just so he could get out of the hard work. Scott wasn't the only engine who had done an international visit. In the Netherlands, City of Truro had visited the country to represent Britain, as well as the National Railway Museum along with other locomotives and rolling stock from other European countries to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Dutch railways. A festival was held at Eurotic from June to August that year, and when it was over, Truro went home. Originally, the organisers wanted Mallard, but he had failed his boiler test. Sadly, during that time in July, Margaret Audrey, Wilbert Audrey's wife at 51 years, had passed away due to a fatal heart attack. She was the woman who had suggested to her husband to publish the 3 railway engines as a book, and thanks to her, many people around the world had known about the island of Sodor, its people and railways. Many of the engines, as well as Sir Stephen and Sir Charles Topham Hatt, were saddened by the news and had offered their condolences to Wilbert. Later on in December, Scott returned home after a successful tour of Australia, ending its global trotting adventure on a high note. This is where we end the 1980s. Part 7 will be focused on the 1990s.